I'm the Dark Arts Wizard, and this test case will pass.
Now we've got a little light on the subject. Hi, I'm Paul Grossman, the Dark Arts Wizard, and today I'm going to be talking to you about identifying objects on the fly with a magic object model and something we call class switching in UFT.
Let's get on with it. A little bit about myself. I'm very heavily into social media. I've been doing test automation for 19 years as a beta tester, working in QTP, UFT, Windrunner before that. And I've been on the Test Guild with Joe Colantonio, a really good podcast. You can check me out at episodes 103, 176, and A276. They are all the Halloween episodes, so enjoy that. It's a lot of fun. You can also catch me sometimes at the automationguild.com. I'm on LinkedIn. This is my LinkedIn link over here. I also run a Candy Mapper sandbox for having a very scary defects that are inside of a web browser. Different versions of it, Candy Mapper and Candy Mapper R2 are available out there for your testing pleasure. I also have a lot of followers. I have 1,200 followers on Twitter, 7,000 members inside of my Facebook group, Advanced Test Automation. And if you want to see some interesting videos about QTP, UFT, you can go catch them up on YouTube right here at this link. So let's move on. Today's agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between the maintenance in property changes versus class changes and which one is a little bit more worse. We'll do a high-level walkthrough of how you solve class changes with dynamic class switching, and we'll do a little demo, and then there's one last thing, thinking outside the box, which we talk about sandwich sync. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when a property like name changes. Let's say billing here changes to some other value. Well, that's no big deal because the code over here where it says link billing, this text over here, billing, isn't this text for this name. It is actually this name over here. So if this value changes, no big deal. You just change this one value here and all your references change. No big problem. It does become a problem if you happen to have your class change. So if the web button becomes a class which is now a link, well, you have to replace all of the objects that are referenced in there that have changed. Plus, you have to change every code reference that used to say web button and now is a link. And well, let's talk a little bit about how much of a nightmare that could be. You get all these different errors, cannot identify the object, and no test case works, and you get these run errors inside here and steps failing. It's just horrible to look at. Now, let me tell you a little bit about a case study. We were working on a project about 2 years in flight. And this application, we were running test cases on it, a full 100 test case suite, just about every quarter. So every 3 months we would run these, and it would take about an hour and a half to get our results. No big deal, and occasionally we'd find a defect, but more often than not, there was really nothing that we'd found. And everything went along just hunky-dory until they decided to do a new build with a new underlying structure. And it turned out that all of our links changed into web buttons, and the only test case that was working was the login test case. What we figured was that there would be about 50 elements to replace and recreate in the repository. Plus, there was a lot of copy pasting going on when the project was initially started, long before I got onto there. And there was about 4 to 5 code references for every one of these objects. So we had about 200 to 250 places that we had to fix this code. We figured it would take us about 1 to 2 days of downtime to fix that. And of course, a client who's expecting to see results in 2 hours isn't going to like that. So we came up with a different solution, which was to programmatically search for a matching web button. And the way you do that is just to override the click method, map the properties to the web button, get a collection of those web buttons, and find the first one that is visible, and go click on it. So how do we do that? Well, step 1 is override that click method, and there's 2 options here. One is to create a function called click and use register user function to replace the click method that is being used by the link over here. So this is the click method in the link, and it is being replaced by the click function that we've used over here. Now, you might say, Paul, I don't know how the register user function works. This is all new to me. How do I write that code? How would I even possibly know where to start? Oh, the cool thing is that UFT1 has a function definition generator inside of it. So you just tell it, what's the name of your function? It's going to be called click. Great. And we're going to register it to a test object like link over here. Well, there's my link over there. So we're going to register it to it. And we're going to override the click method. And once you set these three values over here, you get this code over here. This code is the same as this code and this code down here. This is the same lines. The only thing I added was the kind of the middle stuff there, but it's very, very easy to create the way to override this method. Now that is a very fast implementation. The other option is you can just put click in front of your element. This is looking for an object to pass to our click method, and that's our object that we're going to pass to click. So this takes a little bit more time because you are still changing every reference that you've got. Over here, you are automatically changing everything here, but it does run slightly slower. All right, so what are we going to do with this? Oh, well, we go and check to see if this object exists, and if it does, we click on it, or we get a valid object and click on that if we have a valid object to find. So how do we do this? Well, here's our path. Our happy path says, yeah, we want inside of our click, we have a method called verify object. Inside of verify object, we say, does this object exist? It's the code you just saw on the previous slide. And if it says true, and remember this exists, this is 0. We're not waiting around seconds for this to appear. It's just, it has to be there or it's not there. And we'll talk a little bit about page synchronization in the end of the session. Now, what happens if we have an unhappy path? No object is found. Well, then we go and do a little bit of extra trickery over here. First of all, we need to take a look at our properties and try and build a matching class for the replacement class. So we had a link over here. So our MIC class is going to change from a link to a web button. And our HTML tab for a link is an A, but the HTML tag for a button is just a button. The real important thing to kind of take a look at is what is the text that we're looking for. So we're passing in the value of text like billing, and we're going to map it to a matching value. Inner text is a matching value that we want for a web button. Okay, great. Now that we've got that, we go and get a collection of these elements. And we might come back with just one matching element. We may come back with 3 of them. So what we want to do is go through those 3 elements and say, is the first one visible? Is the second one visible? It is. Great. Go click on it. Is the third one visible? Click that. That's fine. Are none of them visible? Okay, we didn't find an element, an object, so write an error. All right, so this is the way it works. We go and find this object, and we find the path is we found our web buttons, so we return our web buttons. Now this exists equals true. So this is visible, and we find these elements. And by the way, how do you know if something is visible? Well, if you're using an Angular object, you have a height greater than 0. So if an object doesn't exist, it doesn't have a height. And you could use width as well. You don't necessarily have to use both. That's kind of belt and suspenders, but you just take a look and see if it's height. Visible property hasn't worked in years. Don't even try to bother to use it. Quick tip over there. All right, so this object is found, and we go and click on it. Now, what happened in our story there? Well, we were able to implement this in 90 minutes. I mean, it's not a lot of code. It's probably about 15 lines of code. We got it implemented in 90 minutes. The downside was that there was about a quarter-second increase in the object detection on the ones that did not exist. If it did exist, just as fast as it was before. Maintenance, right shifted to the next sprint, which means all of that work that we had to do that we thought would take us 2 days, we didn't have to do it until the next release came back. And remember, it was quarterly, so we now had 3 months to do 2 days worth of work. Much better scenario. Another con, 3% of our failures were still, objects were still found. We still had at least one object could not be found. The 3 of the objects just could not be found. In fact, it was the same object in one test. It just had such a weird description that we had to go and replace it in the object repository and replace the code references. But that wasn't too bad because that was just one object versus 50. Hey, I'm okay with that, right? And the last thing, those last 2% of failing test cases out of the 5, well, they were actually finding a defect. 2 of our test cases were failing because of one defect. So we had a great ROI. We found a defect. We had results to the client with an hour-and-a-half delay. And they understood that there was going to maybe some sort of delay because of that change in the architecture. And let's do a quick live demo now. All right, let's take a quick 5-minute demo to show exactly what we're talking about here. In this case, I want to click on 2 buttons, the Get in Touch button, and if I click it, it should take me to the middle of my web page. And then I'm going to click on Send. That's going to generate this error message here. We're not validating that at the moment. That would be for a later time. We're just trying to click these 2 links to get the responses that we expect. And here's our code. I'm just going to have an element called Get in Touch, which is sitting inside my repository. And I also have a button called a link called Send. And that one's over here. We assign those to values, and we're going to go and click on them. So I'm going to go give this a run, and let's see what this does. The first thing is we're going to reset this browser over here so that we get rid of our email error message there. And then we're waiting for the page to build. And the next thing is we're going to go and click on that Get in Touch button. And if it works, it takes us to the middle of our page, which it did. Excellent. And the next thing is we're going to click that Send button to go get our error. Where's my error? Well, my error blew up over here because this is the actual error. Cannot identify the object send. And because it's not actually a link, it's actually a button. So we're going to talk a little bit and show you the class switching that goes on. So I'm going to go over to my class switching library. The first thing of that solution we said is to build a click method that can replace the click that we're using. So inside my click method, it's going to go and ask and say, can you get a valid object? And if it can, then it's going to click on that object. And this is the object that it passes in, and it'll be replaced if it doesn't exist. Part 2 is that Get Valid Object. We're going to check inside here to see if the object actually exists, and if it does, that's great. We report back and say, hey, we found this object. If it doesn't exist, then we go and do something a little bit more interesting. We're going to create an object description using getting the test object properties. Now this is a little bit more complex version that we showed you in the slides. And we're going to go through all of those properties and build a dictionary of those properties based on the name and the value each one has. And then next we go and say, okay, I need to find out if there is a class that I can switch. Is this a class that I know? And the only one that we're going to do for this demo is to switch the link to a web button. And then we're going to create a new description of a class of a web button and an HTML tag of button. And then our inner text of our new description is going to be whatever value was passed out of our original link out of the text property. So text is going into the inner text over here. Now, if we didn't find a class to switch for this, we just say, hey, we didn't find it, and that would be the exit over here. However, we are looking for some other elements. So what we do is we go through each of these properties, and we're going to print them out in our output just for the demo. And then we're going to go and get a bunch of child objects off the page. Here's that browser index 0 and page index 0 using that new description. And it comes back and says, well, how many objects did we found? If there was nothing, hey, there was nothing that we found. Otherwise, there was either one or more. So we're going to go through each one of these objects and see if it was visible. And if it is visible, then we're going to set the object to the one that we found and output and say, hey, I found a magic object. And then we'll even highlight it. Don't do highlights just for demos. This one is too slow. And then we exit out of this because we found one that's visible. We found the first visible object, and this is exactly what we wanted to do. Okay, now this is our last one. We were looking for if this object is visible. And of course, we check to see if our height is greater than 0. And if it is, there's a few other things it does to try and scroll it onto screen and bring it up. And lastly, it does a quick little highlight of the element to say that it found it. And here's our last little trick, implementation. We're going to implement the method override by using register user function on a link to replace the click method with the click property. And by the way, this is case sensitive, so make sure that you get this one correct. Lowercase click here, uppercase click there. Alrighty, so let's go take a look. That's lowercase. That's our case matching. There is some case matching in VBScript. Who would have known? All right, let's give this a run and see what it does now. We refresh our browser. And we're going to click on our, this one works. And now we jump into this override. Okay, does the object exist? Well, yes, it does. So we are going to execute through this. It clicks on it. And now we're going to go and step through this one. The click goes to our click override. And we'll talk a little bit about that sync in a moment. Get valid object goes in here. Does it exist? No, it doesn't. Okay, go and get all of my elements. And it spits them out. Here they are. That object consists of text for send, mid classes link, and HTML_A. And now we say, oh yeah, we do have a link. We're going to switch it to a web button, and we're going to go and grab a whole bunch of objects. And we are going to see how many objects it found. And it's saying, searching how many elements over here? Let's see. It is searching one similar object. Cool. And we're going to step into see if it's visible. Yes, it is. And then we're going to scroll it, but there's nothing to scroll. Exit out. Say we found an object. There's our object that we wanted to highlight for our demo. And say we're going to go click on it. And when we click on it, what happens? There is our error message that we were looking for. All right, let's get back to our slides, and we'll talk a little bit about why we have this sync and this sync in there, because that is the extra thinking outside the box, the sandwich sync. So let's take one more look at the code and how do you find these elements in different tools? Well, in UFT, you do it like this. You can create a description object using description create, and then whatever the properties that you are using, you pass them in with the values that you need. This is our tag name that we are changing over here. And then we go and say, get child objects based on that description. And in this case, I'm clicking the 0 button. I know we talked about stuff being visible. I don't have enough room on the slide to put all that code in there. So this would go through and iterate all of the elements and see which one was visible, and then click on the most visible one, on the one that has height or width. This is the same way you do it in LeanFT or UFT Pro. We do our description with a new button description builder. There's our type being submit, our name, send, and our tag button over here. And then we go and build it. And then we create a collection of buttons using find children. Same thing. Go and click on the first visible one. In Selenium Java, we can do it this way with a string description, input, type, submit, send is the name, and then tag name is button. Oh, look at this. I'm missing one quote, a single quote over there. Bad, Polly, bad slides. All right, and then you get a list of web elements, but there is another way that you can do this as well. Here's our description. And we're looking for a button over here, and we will just create an XPath description. So this is an XPath description. We get our elements, and then we look to see if our element size is greater than 1. Did we find one or more elements that are visible? If we did, that's great. But if it's less than 1, it means there were no elements found. You can do also class switching here, where we switched from the button to a link over here. So there's another way we can do that. using our description of our path, and that's our description. Go find it. And by the way, also notice that this is saying this is an exact match to whatever element text was passed in, and this one contains the text, and this is a close match. So a couple extra tricks that you can do out there. Now, I talked about thinking outside the box, the sandwich sync. And what is that? You remember we said this exist is a 0, meaning we assume that that element is going to be existing. But how do we handle the synchronization when we do this? Well, we add 2 more lines to our click override. In fact, you should actually use a custom click for every time you go and click on an element. And what we do here is that we go and say browser index 0. That is whatever the current browser is. There's lots of different ways. You probably should be setting your own browser and page elements, but in this case, this is just a generic description to whatever the browser is that we found, whatever the current page on that browser, since nobody uses pages anymore. We can just say index equals 0, and you do a synchronization on it. Then do all that code in the middle. And then you do it one more time. And what does this mean? Think of it as 2 clicks being called right in a row, which means this is the last sync that occurs just after you clicked it, or here. And this is another sync that occurs just before you click something else, which means you're going to catch any sort of page builds that you happen to have with Ajax. All right, well, what else do we have? Well, class switching is actually part of the natural language processing utility that I did for test project, and it's also part of the magic object model that we kind of snuck in there as well. And if you want to play around with it, you can actually see it over here at test project as an add-in. It's got my name, Dark Arts Wizard. There's my picture over there if you want to play around with it. So lots of different tools. You can implement this idea in almost whatever tool you happen to be working with. And QTP is exactly where I started with it 11 years ago. All right, I'm Paul Grossman, the Dark Arts Wizard. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation. Thank you so much for visiting Vivid, and have yourself a great day.